excited to be here. I think Kathleen echoed the sentiments well. So when the Tezos Commons team reached out and said, hey, we're doing this event, do you want to come share some thoughts? I was like, yes, I would love to, because I've been spending a lot of time thinking about governance more broadly, and have been involved in the Tezos community in various ways, and have a lot of thoughts that I wanted to share, and hopefully it'll foster some discussion. And so Kathleen and I have a fun joke. I'm not good at speaking French. I speak a lot of other languages, but my mouth can't do French, so my French is terrible. So every time we are in Paris, we go to restaurants, and I embarrass her by ordering things in French and sounding terrible. So my talk is called Mais pourquoi? Is that right? Probably not at all. But really, it's okay. So what is the why for Tezos? My lawyers say I have to use this, so there it is. My disclosures are all online. So what I really want to talk about is we have gotten to a certain point in Tezos. We've built the protocol, and that was 3 years of really interesting times. And I won't, go through the full history of it, but it's certainly been interesting. It's been filled with ups and downs. I think the founding of Tezos, just like the founding of America, as Allison actually pointed out, was filled with factions and interesting battles. But here we are. The network launched last year, and we've seen the network grow tremendously over time. I myself run a delegation service with two of my colleagues, Bo and Josh. It's called Tezigator, but there are a number of others. There are people who are self-baking, and the community around baking and delegation has really grown. There are a number of great tools that have been developed, some of which are open source. And now we're seeing the governance layer get implemented. So we had this Athens proposal period we went through. That's now moving forward. There's still some time to go there, but it's really exciting to see that 40% of the community turned out to participate and make their opinion known on this Athens matter. And where we're getting to now is, well, we've built all this stuff. All of these things are now possible. There is a network that now exists. What are we going to do with it? But why? This is sort of my question with everything in the crypto space as someone who started in Bitcoin. The question is, but why? So let's talk about that. So when I think about how the space has gotten built, I think there are a number of different metrics to look at. One of the things that I think is really important is to move beyond. I know a lot of people who will sit on their phone, they're like looking at CoinMarketCap or Blockfolio, and they're like, oh yeah, this coin's like really running. Forget that. It's not what this is about. So when I think about measuring what's happening and thinking about where progress is going to come from, I go back to kind of this structure of how these things get built. So when I look at Tezos, right, I look from the bottom up, the protocol layer. Who's working on building the protocol? How are we incentivizing people to submit proposals and amendments to the protocol? Because people need to pay for services, they need to pay rent. So how are we going to incentivize people to submit protocol upgrades? How have tokens been distributed? So I've done some writing on the Gini coefficient in Tezos and initial distribution, how that might change over time. But how wealth and governance are controlled is really important. That's an issue that's existed for a long time. Feudalism is a great example of what goes wrong. I've written quite a bit about the Polybius cycle and sort of the history of political systems development, but how tokens are distributed really matters. Network concentration, then one layer up. So what's the distribution of power? How many bakers and delegation services are there? Is it easy for people to do this themselves? And then what is the incentive? So there is the staking reward right now. Is that sufficient to incentivize people to secure the network? There's another layer, I kind of want to separate the network, which is facilitating computation on top of Tezos and providing civil resistance and security. That's one function. And then there's a second function that's governance, and the two are very different. And I think right now the two are sort of together, but in reality, the people who are going to care about one and the other are very different. And so we had this first governance decision. There will be many more. It'll be interesting to see how the participation rate evolves over time. And then the layer that we haven't gotten to, which is kind of an esoteric and difficult to measure layer, is this ecosystem and this community that everyone talks about. How do you measure that? There are 80 of us sitting in a room on Saturday talking about it, but how do we start to measure that? And more importantly, how do we actually get people to use Tezos for more than just financial speculation? hands. Sorry, we'll talk about it. We can have a good discussion on stage. So again, because this is sort of philosophy themed, and because Kathleen already referred to my favorite economist quotes, we're going to have French existentialist quotes. So here's Sartre saying, did I say it right? Sartre. I have to like cough into the microphone. Hell is other people. So let's talk about governance. So I actually think governance is one of the really interesting things we can do with Tezos that makes sense to a lot of people, but we're not really talking about it the right way or in a language people can understand. So what I did for fun, because I think numbers are fun and understanding context is important, is look at the turnout for governance in the real world, which is the stuff on the left-hand side. So I looked at the turnout for Brexit, the US midterm election, and the Estonian elections, which were done digitally. So Estonia has digital voting that you can do on your mobile phone using your digital identity. And so we can see there the turnout rates. Brexit was quite high, it's close to 80%. US elections typically around 60 to 70%, and then the Estonian election, surprisingly, is lower. Even though it's easier to vote, the participation rate is lower. And then on the other side, we see crypto network governance participation. So we can see in Tezos, even though over 80% of Tezos is delegated, only about 40% participated in this Athens proposal, which is interesting. We see Decred, in Decred it's difficult to sort of untangle, but what I looked at wasn't the proof of work side, but I looked at assets that are participating in Politeia, which is their online sort of governance system. So I split the two out, so you can see for their proof of stake mining, participation's high, but again, for governance decisions in Politeia, which is their voting mechanism, is quite low. EOS has about a 25% participation rate in voting for block producers. The Ethereum hard fork coin vote that was done in 2016, if anyone remembers that, had about a 5% participation rate, and the majority came from 5 wallets. And then Aragon has a really low participation rate. Aragon is an ERC20 token. It's a protocol designed to provide governance to other protocols, but the voting on their own protocol is quite low. The first proposal was 2.5%. Their most recent proposal that had a vote had a participation rate of 0.3%, with 3 wallets comprising 87% of the votes. So why do I share these things? Why am I talking about this? Because as Allison aptly pointed out, and we did not plan this at all, by the way, governance is really, really hard. Look at our world today. It's a complete clusterfuck because governance is really, really difficult. And governance in crypto networks is only going to get more difficult over time as the issues and the stakes become more contentious. And more importantly, as people who have invested a lot of time and energy into these things start to have differences in vision of where these things might go. We've already seen this. I'm a Bitcoiner. I spent a lot of time in the Bitcoin community over the last 6 years. The Bitcoin community has forked numerous times into separate factions, into separate communities, into separate ecosystems. The Ethereum community is now going through kind of a similar evolution. All of these networks over time, as they grow in value, as they grow in usage, and as they grow in the amount of time and energy, really human capital, that people put into these things, you start to see people fundamentally disagree on direction, and this leads to sort of a forking or a separation of interests. So to me, this is one of the more important things around Tezos if we think about but why. It's how do we design governance systems that are on-chain, like they are here, and then how do we evolve the Tezos governance mechanism to ensure it stays effective, to keep participation rates high, whether that's by designing better interfaces to facilitate participation in governance. A lot of it, I think, will be through better education and advocacy, tools that enable people to understand what it is they're actually voting on. I think most people who voted for or against Brexit did not necessarily understand what they were voting on, which is terrifying to think about. But to me, this is one of the most important reasons I'm interested in Tezos. We have the opportunity to, for the first time ever, to A/B test whether or not these things work. So that's how I view it. It's kind of like a massive experiment as to whether or not a group of people can actually work together towards a common goal, or whether this community too, over time, will splinter into separate factions, separate forks, etc. And I apologize if that's depressing, but after 6 years of watching this happen over and over and over and over and over again, it kind of feels inevitable, but maybe there's a way forward. So now we'll go to Camus, who is an absurdist, and one of my favorite Camus quotes is, "We are all special cases." So let's talk about applications, right? So I have no idea what applications are going to get built on Tezos. Kathleen's working on COAS. I've heard a few other ideas that are getting built. There are ideas around different DAOs that can be utilized to incentivize development at the protocol layer. I've heard just today that there's some work being done around developing sovereign identity project on top of Tezos. But I think this is the real but why issue. What are we going to build with this stuff that people will actually want to use? Open question. I don't know yet. I am looking for it, but I don't know what's going to get built. I don't know if people will actually want to use it. Right now, there are $4 billion worth of network value on proof of stake chains that have functions similar to and different from Tezos. There are another 24 projects that are launching over the next 12 to 24 months that have similar aims. So I really do think there is a lot of networks and not a whole lot of use cases. And so to me, this is actually the most important issue we have to overcome is we've put all this work and time in. We've gotten to this point where a lot of this stack has gotten built. A lot of these tools now exist. There's tremendous amount of interest. There's a high rate of delegation and participation in the network. But what are we going to build with it? This, to me, is really the big defining moment for Tezos, is what are we going to use this for, and what is it going to do over time? And to me, the biggest issue here is communication education. Most people don't know what Tezos is. Most people I speak to don't understand how it's different from or unique in any sort of way. And so to wrap up this meandering conversation, we have to go, obviously, to another French existential quote from Simone de Beauvoir, which is, "Capabilities are clearly manifested only when they've been realized." So I think what we in this room need to do, and I myself have been trying to do this for the last few years that I've been interested in Tezos, is we are the evangelists for Tezos. We are the people who are going to define what direction this project goes, we being the people in this room, but also collectively the people who have made the time to come to this event, the people who are participating in dialogues, whether it's online, in person, going to meetups, whether it's on Reddit, whether it's in private conversation with your friends, your team. This is our collective responsibility to do, and I think we could do it a lot better. I think we could do it a lot more collaboratively, but the real question is, but why? So we have all of these tools, we've built all of these things. What next? I'm excited to see what happens next. My role, I'm not a developer, I'm not an engineer. I participate, I invest, and I help create ecosystems. So I'm interested in learning about what you're working on, helping you figure out how to capitalize it, and helping you figure out how to get people to use it. So that is my contribution. Hopefully that is not too esoteric, and I look forward to debating it with Kathleen and Allison. I've heard it was a Real Housewives style smackdown. Okay, cool, got it.